Hello, I'm Stan Sandler, Dr. Sandler, Stan the History Man, with another presentation of history for you. At this time, I'd like to talk about the Korean War, and I thought maybe to make things a little more structured, shall we say, could use my book, The Korean War, No Victors, No Vanquished, and published quite a few years back, I have to admit. But I'd like to take it chapter by chapter and just see how, rather than just kind of going off on my own. And the first chapter is a history and background of the Korean War, and I should get into that because the Japanese just took over Korea in 1910, just took it over. That's the way they did things back in those days, and they ruled it as an empire, just the way the British would rule India or Ceylon or whatever, but even more brutally. The Japanese were brutal, and the Koreans themselves could never rise above the position of maybe a school teacher or a locomotive engineer, if that. So they chopped down most of the forests in Korea as well, because Japan is kind of short on wood too. So the Japanese hated the Koreans, and the relief only came in 1945 when Russia declared war on Japan and just swept across Manchuria and northern Korea. And as the Russians do, they set up a People's Republic. Not originally, it set up a military dictatorship and then a People's Republic of North Korea. The Americans, a little worried about what are the Russians doing up there, sent in 2 divisions to southern Korea. And they made a line across they said the 30th parallel, that latitude, that kind of goes through the middle of Korea. And so in the south there was a military occupation. And I'll tell you one thing, I'm quite proud of our occupations of Germany and Austria, and I was there after the war. I think we did the right thing. But in Korea, they said that they treated the Germans and the Austrians, the enemies, better than they treated the victims of the Japanese. A very, not so much harsh, but insensitive army rule. It didn't really take into account the culture and feelings of the Koreans of the time. Still, you can always tell by the refugee movement, the refugees always went from north to south, from the people's paradise to the north to the capitalistic hell of South Korea. In 1948, 48, North Korea became the People's Republic, one of those squalid People's Republic, which is just a dictatorship. And then in 1949, the United States, sorry, I got it backwards, Russia in 1949, the United States in 1948, the Republic of Korea, which of course both these countries still exist today. They hated each other. Each side, the South Koreans and the North Koreans were just the tools of the Russians, which in most respects they were. The North Koreans said the South Koreans were the tools of the Americans. Well, they got a lot of money from us, but they also gave us a lot of back talk. They were hardly puppets of us. So we kind of wish they were more, maybe. Things would be smoother. So it went on like that, and border raids back and forth. South Korea was having small raids into the north, onto North Korea, liberate the north, and Pukchin, liberate our brothers in the north, and there's not a chance in heck of that. And then, of course, the North Koreans labored free the capitalist slaves in South Korea. A lot of shooting and deaths back and forth. And we kept the South Koreans on pretty much a tight leash. Didn't give them tanks or heavy artillery because they're afraid they might try to invade North Korea and then they'll get their heads handed to them because the North Koreans were being supplied by the Soviets all through this period. Then in June 25th, 1950, it's almost as though North Korea said, enough of this, we're going to go for the whole enchilada. A massive invasion, which caught the South Koreans flat-footed. There are a few academic types of that. Well, maybe South Korea had something to do with the invasion. We know half the South Korean army was on leave. That's no way to mount an invasion. And so the South Korean army was rolled back by the tank-led Russian T-34 tanks of World War II, which rolled over the South Koreans. There were places where the South Koreans did fight well. I think we have the other, they just rolled up, but that's not true. There were places where they fought well. As a matter of fact, I've seen some messages from North Korean command saying our men we're not doing as well as we thought. Still, by the third day of the war, Seoul had fallen, And then the question comes, what should we do about this? Now, South Korea was not a part of our defense perimeter. We'd made that clear, made it clear to the Russians and the North Koreans, the Chinese too, that we would not defend South Korea. So now what do we do? Well, it was just an act of blatant aggression. I mean, South Korea was not a member of the United Nations, but a recognized entity of the United Nations. It was recognized by the United Nations. So just let it get taken over. So this decision was made to send troops to fight North Korea. And we were fortunate, of course, that occupation troops were stationed in Japan, and they were ferried over quickly, airlifted over in C-54s to Korea, and they met the North Korean army at Suwon, just south of Suwon, under we had so-called Task Force Smith. And we thought it'd be pretty easy, but these guys are in T-34 tanks, and they rolled over us. It was a serious defeat for the Americans. Our first defeat, of course, first combat since World War II, and we're sent pell-mell back about 20 or 30 miles. Tried to hold on after that at Kaesong, make a stronger defense there, and that was a real defeat. In fact, we lost our general there. General Smith of the 24th Division was actually captured by the North Koreans, and several thousand dead casualties. It was a real disaster. We were not ready. We were so busy. So what were we doing before the Korean War? Any plans or anything? No, not for that kind of war. See, we were the war of the future. Atomic bombs, giant 6-engine B-36 bombers, giant aircraft carriers. That's what's going to. Well, none of this made any sense. I say we look upon the war of the future all the time, like that high technology. We wind up fighting the next war in somebody else's rice paddy or sandbox, and that's exactly what happened here. Our men were not well combat trained. Now, they weren't as soft as some people say. Occupation duty in Japan was pretty soft, but nonetheless, General Ridgway, when he's commander of the 8th Army in Korea, he did tighten up the training and so on. So it wasn't completely as bad as all that, but it was bad. I mean, we were defeated. There's no question. The North Koreans were tough. They had a savage discipline. Get out of line, you get shot. I mean, really, it's that simple. And one after Kaesong is one after another. But what happened, though? Our supply lines were getting shorter from Korea, and a lot of World War II surplus and so on, whereas the North Korean lines were getting longer as the further they came from North Korea. Finally, along the Nakton River, we were able to hold out, just barely hold on by our fingernails. I mean, it was terrible fighting and terrible heat. They say that the men's belts just rotted right off their pants. I mean, it was just hot, humid against an enemy that was really, well, of course, I said savage discipline, but it's more than that. You see, here's one of our big failings in the Korean War. If we won, Korea would remain disunited. We just push them out of South Korea and reestablish South Korea again. If they won, they're going to take over the whole enchilada, all of Korea, and so they can say, I'm fighting, I may not be a communist, I won't tell anybody, but I'm really fighting for the unity of my country. So that was one great advantage that the other side had. Nationalism, we're fighting for Korea, not North Korea or South Korea. But some really hard fighting by the Marines, the 27th Infantry Regiment, managed to hold on there. Of course, we had complete air power. There were a few strikes by North Korean obsolescent aircraft early in the war, and we shot them out of the sky. So we had complete control of the air, and we had complete control of the sea. All of our ships coming over, loaded with troops, loaded with equipment, loaded with supplies. Not one of them was ever attacked by a North Korean submarine or torpedo boats or anything like that. And that's a big advantage that we had. You can line up the advantages of both sides if you want to do that sometime. So we held on, and the became more and more desperate. The North Korean command wanted to complete the capture of Seoul, which is the furthest south city. It was never taken by the North Koreans on August 15th, because that would be the 5th anniversary of the liberation of Korea from the Japanese. And say, you've got to just make that one last push. But the Nakton practically ran red with blood but they couldn't get across it. And one of the problems we faced, of course, was men, refugees heading for us, for the capitalistic landlords and bankers and so on. They seemed to prefer that. And a lot of North Koreans wore the civilian uniforms. There'd be other cases where there'd be a mass of refugees trying to get across a bridge that we were going to blow because the North Koreans were right behind them. We had to tell them, get off. And they wouldn't. We blew up the bridge with the refugees on board. Well, it's war. War is tough. And certainly not the kind of war we prepared for or planned for, not prepared, planned for before 1950, before the start of the Korean War. But MacArthur was, of course, appointed commander of U.S. forces in Korea. He fought under the United Nations flag. That's an advantage we had also. Most of the developed nations of the world were on our side. They said you can't just invade somebody else's country, and they put their money where their mouth was. There were 16 countries sent troops to Korea. There were so many. They had a whole Commonwealth division of British troops, and they had troops from Turkey, and from Belgium, from Holland. So it was it wasn't just as in Vietnam, just fighting on our own. Well, MacArthur was under the United Nations. He was in command of the military operations in Korea. And he had a plan fairly early in the retreat, when we were just pell-mell retreating, to get behind the North Koreans. They planned at Incheon, which is the port of Seoul. I don't know why they ever made a port there in the first place. It's got like 15-foot rise in tides. So only a couple hours a day you can have anything going in and out of there. But he said that's the whole point. They're not going to think we're going to land there. And so on September 15th, so you go from June 25th to September 15th before we turn it around. September 15th, we launch a operation, a large tripartite land, sea, and air operation against the North Korean fortifications at Incheon, caught them completely flat-footed. One American died in the bombardment and landing at Incheon. Well, I think right there I'll cut it off and get on with the rest of the story later. Thank you for listening. Talk to you later. Dr. Sandler, Stan the History Man. Bye-bye.